Further debate? I recognize the member from Toronto Centre.
Thank you, Speaker. It's a pleasure to rise today to speak to this motion. As one of the 3 Indigenous members of this legislature, and as far as I know, the first Indigenous woman ever elected to this House, I certainly support the notion of raising the profile of Indigenous issues within this legislature. The proposed idea of creating an Indigenous Relations Committee for this Assembly is certainly an interesting one, but I'd be remiss if I didn't raise some significant concerns that I have. My primary concern is the complete lack of consultation in relation to this motion. Not only did the member from Lanark, Frontenac, Kingston not consult with any of the 3 Indigenous members of this House, I'm not entirely sure he consulted with anyone. Speaker, the specific point I'd like to make here is that there is no homogeneous Indigenous experience, and the process of reconciliation must recognize the diverse and unique experiences of Indigenous people and communities. My colleague, the member from Kiiwetinoong, brings a unique perspective to this House from a Northern and remote First Nations voice. My colleague, the member from Mishkigowuk James Bay, brings another important perspective as a Métis man, also from a Northern riding. And I stand here as a woman with mixed Indigenous heritage, raised in downtown Toronto in an entirely urban setting. And the urban Indigenous community is a home that many of us turn to when histories of adoption and foster care in our families have tried to make us the success stories of assimilation. Places like friendship centres give us the space and resources to reclaim our identities, languages, and cultures, and to piece together our bundles. It's a place for people who are coming home to their identities, maybe for the first time, in whatever way and whatever timeline that looks like, after generations of foster care, adoption, and residential schools. Any Indigenous committee process in this House needs to reflect the diversity of our communities, and I do not see that represented here today. The member from Lanark, Frontenac, Kingston can't just declare as himself, all by himself, as a white legislator, that he knows better than any of our communities how to do the work of decolonizing the literal seat of colonial power for the province of Ontario. Which brings me, Speaker, to the member's track record on Indigenous issues, and I have to call into question the intent of bringing forward this motion at a moment in history when all eyes are on Wet'suwet'en and the national conversation we are having about reconciliation. On his own website, the member published a post on February 17, 2020 on the subject of land defenders in Tyendinaga, standing in solidarity with Wet'suwet'en. And he's repeated many of those remarks here today in this debate, and I quote, "Small groups of radical, privileged, and dishonest ideologues are attempting to derail Canadian society. These groups have hijacked our charitable dispositions, successfully stifled our freedom of speech through coercive political correctness, distorted our education, rewritten our history, abused freedom of assembly, caused financial harm and grave disruption to our economy, while seeking to impoverish and lower the standards of all Canadians regardless of their ancestry." And if I didn't know any better, Speaker, I would suggest he was speaking of the colonial history of Canada, not of Indigenous people in Ontario. And I think what he makes perfectly clear in these statements is that the member sees himself as having some sort of self-appointed purpose to single-handedly save our communities with the gospel of capitalism and the gospel of forced pipelines, and that he has no basic working knowledge of the violent and genocidal history of this country. Speaker, I cannot think of a worse foundation on which to have this committee brought into existence in this House. Miigwech.